the fuck do the worst people come?
When I tell you, I've been waiting my whole life to answer this question. Like, I've been in social activism for over 10 years and then recently found myself in places like this, getting really proximate to power and understanding how it works and why, from the outside, so many powerful people seem to be just like doing terrible things. And for today, I'm going to focus on capitalism because that's kind of what I've seen the most of, but there's a lot to say. I feel like we have to really understand who this person is and how they end up becoming so powerful. It can be really tempting to look at capitalism as like a fixed system, but in fact, the answer lies in how they get there and who they become along the way. And I'm going to talk about the average person who typically has some element of privilege, whether that's in terms of their money, their parents, their education, their network, which is priming their success in a capitalist world and also like shaping their sort of baseline inclinations about the world. This average person, let's say, does not have parents who are interested in social justice. They're probably part of capitalist worlds themselves or somewhat disillusioned by non-capitalist spaces. So this privilege ultimately serves as a foundation for getting into like a good school, which in my opinion is where a lot of the capitalist conditioning actually happens. It's worth noting that a lot of people actually begin by studying stuff like political science or economics or history, only to never pursue work in that area. I think it suggests that there is an element of curiosity and optimism when you're like 18 or 19, which soon dies out. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is the fact that when you're about to graduate, you're basically getting presented with a very narrow set of options. It's usually stuff like consulting, banking, or tech that come to recruit as a... And these places don't just sell you like the dream around money and status. They in fact paint it as a very no-brainer choice to join these companies because they focus a lot on the kind of learning and the skills that you're going to develop in these areas. It's also painted as a very no-brainer choice for the reason that you can do it for a few years and then go off to do something else. Or at least that's what they say. Especially in contrast to like non-profits and politics and stuff like that, right? Like those things are painted as slow and poorly paid, and you're basically told that you can kind of do them later. What this does is lure a large number of people who may not have pursued capitalist jobs to get into them. The next step is that once you're in these jobs, I think it's very easy to forget just how much they shape your reality. Not only are you spending a bunch of time in these places, you're also now becoming part of a cultural class that does things a certain way. So whether that's your friends, your clothes, like what you do on the weekend, everything begins to slowly shift as you spend just a sheer amount of time at these places. Let's not forget that you're also like 21 to 25, which is a very formative time to be kind of like building your identity and your early conception about the world itself. And this leads to what I like to call alternate realities. It's easy to forget that in the world that we live in, you can literally live down the road from someone who's poor, struggling to make ends meet, and literally have no idea what their conception of reality is actually like. Same with like trillionaires who have private jets and yachts, or everybody in the middle. Because once you begin to occupy that space, everything you do is suddenly very different and very insular. So the media you consume, the social media you have, obviously the levels of income, your clothes, who you're dating, your family, like your For You page, like literally everything about the life you live begins to occupy this world. And what that does is that it shifts the parameters and reference points for what is good and bad. Because each world has a set of norms and incentives about what it considers good behavior and bad behavior. So in the case of a capitalist space, you often find that what is prized is stuff like having a good life, taking care of yourself and your family, prizing logic and intelligence and rationality as like superior qualities, money, naturally, as opposed to things like being too emotional about things or caring too much for the oppressed or for social justice. At the same time, it's really important to note that a lot of these things are rationalized and accommodated within capitalism. So you might, for example, be on the board of an NGO while still making $1 trillion. Like that might be a rational way to think and conceive of your social impact on the world. Or you might be able to find a business that is kind of doing good while not compromising on your quality of life. And lastly, you're going to care a lot about your image and kind of how people perceive you and what your social networks are. Like, I can't stress how important this ends up becoming. So this is what we're working with. Like, these are the things that are considered valuable in a capitalist space. You're constantly getting signals from the world around you that this is what you should be optimizing for in your life over stuff like this. It's very subtle, but very insidious how much this kind of schema about the world ends up basically being internalized by the people themselves. Even if you're a good person, I've noticed that people are generally like well-meaning, but tend to be quite lazy in questioning these things. They're going to rely on everything that is inbound to kind of tell them what is good and bad. And to some extent, I think we're all like this, right? Like we're all following trends and kind of looking at people we admire and looking away from people we don't admire. And that is always going to be contextualized in a social sense. However, I think when you have that much privilege and power, it's crazy that you can just disconnect from realities that you should probably care about. Because finally, let's see what happens when we have situations like today where you have a massive crisis, you have a genocide that is piercing this world quite strongly. So you're getting an element of dissonant information that is making you question, like, are these norms actually good? What is my role in places like this, and should I be rethinking it? This is like creating some contradiction within the world you occupy. At the same time, although it wakes up some people, the majority of people still continue to like be apathetic or neutral or side with whatever their friends are saying. Like, even though you're aware there's a crisis, everything you receive about it is going to be filtered through the people and media in this world. there is a veil, a narrative that is going to be painted upon this thing that's going to prevent you from looking at the situation in the way that you and I might be looking at it. And to cope with that, you're also going to be engaging in some storytelling and some rationalizing and labeling. So when you hear about someone who's like pro-Palestine, you might think, oh, well, they're a lefty, they're woke. Like, you'll create this separation that says, I am not like them. Or you might say, well, there are other people in power who have way more influence over the situation, so I'm okay. Like, people will go to great lengths just to avoid that discomfort. Lastly, we have to remember that even though the information is coming in, it's still a minority of the kind of signals that you're being sent from this world. Like, if 95% of people are still having brunch and living a normal life, you're going to think that is a normal response given these are my values. Also, it's worth pointing out that throughout this journey, you're never really told to like value your inherent worth as an individual. So you're constantly borrowing it based on external attributes. So even when these situations happen, you're still looking for like, what is my value in this world, as opposed to look at how much power I have and what I can do with it. And so you end up normalizing and upholding a very oppressive system and being complicit in stuff that maybe a version of you before would have said no to.